Hello, I'm Anthea Wilson, and I'd like to share some ideas around work transitions in healthcare, but it could apply to many other settings too. To make some sense of how we can understand unfamiliar roles and work environments, I'm going to introduce you to three terms used by philosopher Martin Heidegger to describe human experience. Umwelt, eigentlich Self, and uneigentlich Self. And don't worry, I will explain these. Let's think about Umwelt first of all. I love this picture. It provides so much insight into the experience of moving to a new work environment that you're not completely prepared for. This schoolmistress has found herself in a completely new social world. I'll come back to this. However unfamiliar a work environment might be, it will never be as though you've just landed on Jupiter. There are still familiar things to hook into. Look again at this painting. Although it's all very unfamiliar to her, the schoolmistress has still found herself in a community of some sort. She might not have a proper classroom, but she will eventually be able to find somewhere to put her desk. And someone might still bring her flowers to put in her vase. So what does all this have to do with Heidegger and the modern workplace? Heidegger's Umwelt represents the world immediately around a person. Things are meaningful, and people understand themselves and their ambitions in the context of a world that only exists through human activity and interpretation. Let's go along with the idea that the schoolmistress is feeling really fed up and at a loss as to what to do next, like a fish out of water. What use is her desk and her bag of equipment without the structural backdrop, a classroom, and people who understand her role and know what to expect of her? If the world around you becomes unfamiliar, it can impede your practice, even if you are highly skilled normally. Most of the time, when engaged in skilled work, practitioners are focused on what they are aiming to achieve, rather than how to get their tools and equipment to work properly. I'll show you some examples. Playing a tune, pruning a branch, assisting a surgeon, operating on a hernia, shaping wood, and trying to win a race. You get the idea. When someone is skilled and absorbed in whatever they are doing, the equipment is just there in the background, supporting the task. When learning to use equipment, in this case learning to play a guitar, the learner needs to focus on the mechanics of the instrument as well as playing the tune. The people you have just looked at are all existing in a particular, practical, meaningful world. Unfamiliar work environments are uncomfortable and challenging, even for skilled practitioners. Skilled practitioners are focused on their roles when absorbed in their work, rather than on their tools. Learners, on the other hand, need to focus on the new tools and equipment they are learning to use, as well as what they are doing. You might have noticed I'm using the word practitioner very broadly here to represent anyone who develops a set of skills for a particular purpose. People in transition at work might be adjusting to new roles, new work environments, and unfamiliar equipment. At this point, I want to draw your attention to some research I carried out investigating the experiences of nurses who are mentoring students in their workplace. I realised that mentors use their imagination, along with memories of their own student experience, to understand how their own familiar work environment could appear very different from the perspective of their mentees. So it occurred to me that they were trying to notice their own Umwelt from the perspective of the newcomer. This is far from easy, as most of the time people are unaware of many features of their own workplace that a newcomer would notice. More Heidegger then, introducing the uneigentlich Self, which is the mode people are in most of the time. The uneigentlich Self is absorbed in a familiar and public world. The closest translation of uneigentlich is inauthentic. The uneigentlich Self is the they self, which is carried along in the crowd, unburdened by guilt and conscience. Work roles and routines are well established, and people in this mode are interchangeable actors, occupying impersonally defined roles. So a nurse does what nurses do. Drawing together some of the ideas discussed so far, the uneigentliche self is likely to be working in a very familiar environment, or Umwelt, and is able to focus on purposes, rather than worry about how to use the equipment or find their way around. In this mode they can be confident, fluent and intuitive, and see themselves as one of many. When practice is challenged by a situation requiring a practitioner to do things differently or question their usual practice, people may switch to eigentliche mode. The closest translation of this term is authentic. It becomes much more personal. In eigentliche mode, people are burdened by accountability and find themselves exploring their conscience. Individuality manifests itself, and people become prone to angst. Am I doing the right thing, the right way? What if an alternative is better? What if I didn't make the right decision? Here's a summary of what the eigentliche self could look like. People are actively making sense of the situation. They don't take things for granted. Equipment, as well as underlying knowledge, all the tools of the trade, are carefully considered. People in eigentliche mode probably lack their normal fluency and confidence. They feel personally accountable, do not feel easily interchangeable with others, and are prone to guilt. Here are the two together for contrast then. How can this knowledge help those who are supporting workers in transition, or those experiencing transition themselves? An overemphasis on the eigentliche self would be stressful and burdensome, and an emphasis on the uneigentliche self could mean that individual practices are not sufficiently challenged. Perhaps developing awareness of Eigentlichkeit and Uneigentlichkeit can help to signal workforce needs for either support or challenge. The inquiry into Mid Staffordshire NHS Trust, where serious care failings and staff distress went unchecked for several years, identified that the lack of management response was partly attributed to assumptions that someone else would deal with the problems. This appears to be a manifestation of the eigentliche they self, keeping staff busily occupied in their roles, at the expense of the eigentliche self, which would have enabled a greater sense of personal accountability and conscience, although clearly the staff on the ground were only too well aware of the problems. Heidegger explained that these are the inescapable conditions of human existence. The they-self dominates ordinary everyday life. I'm developing two lines of argument. One is to add a new way of conceptualizing thorny management issues of maintaining a motivated, competent, accountable and developing workforce. And the other is to propose that the uneigentliche and eigentliche selves could signal, like a barometer, the effects and implications of change and adaptation. Novel roles or role changes would increase the instance of Eigentlichkeit and temporary lack of fluency in practice. This eigentliche engagement, by implication, places more of a burden on practitioners as individuals and emphasises the importance of peer support and managerial support in the workplace. Conversely, role stability and certainty are conditions that support fluency and confidence, but could blind practitioners to the need for change if equipment and practice strategies or know-how are taken for granted and therefore unnoticed. Therefore, if we could monitor signs of Eigentlichkeit, being burdened by guilt and conscience and finding oneself lacking in some way, and Uneigentlichkeit, being absorbed in a public world, we could obtain valuable information about the impact of role changes in the workforce. This discussion has unpacked some of the human factors impinging on a workforce, and although this is all sprung from a study of nurse mentors, it has implications for the education, training and development of a range of staff groups, and clearly it would be beneficial for further research to investigate the lived experience of redesigned roles and students of health professions with reference to adjusting to new work environments. Also, the implications for managers warrants further investigation to determine best ways of monitoring and understanding the effects of change on individuals' well-being and practice effectiveness. So, the concepts of Eigentlichkeit and Uneigentlichkeit offer a certain way of thinking about people's lived experience of a changing workplace. In a shifting work world containing novel roles, workers are less able to assume a shared public they-self. This leads to a greater sense of personal accountability and increases the burden on individuals. Alternatively, lack of challenge in a role could lead to inertia and lack of personal accountability. These applications of Heidegger's philosophy hopefully can offer new ways of understanding workplace change.